there's a moment. Maybe it was a Sunday morning. Maybe it was a school board meeting you drove past without stopping, when something in you knew you should have shown up and you didn't. It wasn't a dramatic decision. Nobody asked you to choose. Life just moved at its usual speed, and you let the moment pass. And if you're honest, there have been a few of those moments. Maybe more than a few. This video is about what those moments add up to, not in accusation, in diagnosis, because the story you've probably been told about the erosion of American civic and religious life puts you firmly in the role of the person watching something get taken. The culture shifted, the institutions changed, forces you didn't vote for rewrote the rules while you were busy living your life. And that story isn't wrong exactly, but it's missing something. Something Alexis de Tocqueville noticed almost 2 centuries ago when he traveled to this country specifically to understand how it worked. He found the answer in New England, in the townships, in the thing the Puritans built, and what he understood about that thing, what it actually was, what it actually required, will probably surprise you, because it surprised him. In 1831, Tocqueville was 25 years old and already convinced that democracy was the future of the Western world. His question wasn't whether it would come, it was whether it could survive. And so he came to America, the one country where it had been running long enough to study. He expected to find the answer in the Constitution, in the courts, in the architecture of the federal government. Instead, he found it in something much smaller. He found it in the town meeting, in the townships of New England, the ones the Puritans had built 200 years earlier. Tocqueville saw something he hadn't seen in Europe and didn't expect to see anywhere. He saw ordinary people, farmers and merchants and ministers, sitting down together to govern themselves, not to petition a king, not to send a representative to a distant capital and wait for instructions, to do it themselves, directly, in the room. He wrote about this in Democracy in America with a precision that still stops you cold. The New England township, he argued, was the point of departure for everything that came after. Not the Declaration, not the Constitution, the township. Because the township was where Americans first learned that democracy wasn't a gift handed down from above. It was a practice, something you had to do regularly, whether it was convenient or not, or it would stop working. He called those townships free schools in the art of self-government, and he meant that literally. Before there was a federal government to run things, before there was a national identity to appeal to, there were these small communities of people who had decided they would handle their own affairs, who had learned, through practice, that they could. Now, the Puritans were not easy people. Tocqueville didn't romanticize them. Their theology was rigid. Their laws were harsh. They had a narrow vision of who belonged and who didn't. He saw all of that clearly, but he also saw what they had built beneath the theology, beneath the doctrine, a structure of civic habit, of people who expected to participate in their own governance, not as a right they could exercise whenever convenient, but as a responsibility they couldn't delegate, a duty. The word matters. To understand what that actually looked like, you have to go back before Tocqueville, back to the beginning. 1620. November. The Mayflower is sitting in the harbor off Cape Cod, and the men aboard it are facing a problem. They're not where they were supposed to land. Their charter, such as it was, covers Virginia, not Massachusetts, which means there is no legal authority for the colony they're about to establish. No king's patent. No company charter. Nothing. So they wrote one themselves. The Mayflower Compact is 41 signatures on a single page. It is the first governing document written on American soil. And what it says, stripped of its 17th century phrasing, is simply this: we agree to govern ourselves. We will make laws. We will enforce them. We will hold each other accountable. Nobody appointed us. We are appointing ourselves. 11 years later, John Winthrop stood on the deck of the Arbella, about to land in Massachusetts Bay, and gave a sermon that has been quoted ever since, usually for the wrong reason. Everyone remembers City Upon a Hill. What they forget is what came before it. Winthrop's sermon was not a boast. It was a warning. He told his congregation that they had entered into a covenant, a binding agreement with God and with each other. And because of that covenant, they would be watched. Their failures would be visible. Their negligence would matter. The city upon a hill wasn't a compliment. It was a weight. He told them plainly, if they dealt falsely with the covenant, if they let the work become ceremony rather than practice, the watching world would not see a light. It would see a cautionary tale. The Puritans didn't build what they built because they believed they were great. They built it because they believed they were accountable. That distinction is everything. Tocqueville saw it. He saw that the engine running underneath American democracy was not confidence, it was obligation. The sense that citizenship was not a status but a practice, and that the practice required showing up. He also saw something more unsettling. He saw how fragile that practice was. In the second volume of Democracy in America, written in 1840, Tocqueville turned from describing what America had built to warning about what it could lose. And the warning wasn't about foreign invasion, it wasn't about revolution, it was about something much quieter. He argued that the great danger of democratic equality was the tendency it produced in individuals, a tendency he called individualism. Not selfishness, exactly. Something more subtle. The feeling, born of genuine freedom, that you could handle your own affairs without anyone else, that the association, the civic club, the congregation, the township meeting was optional. That participation was something you did when you had time, not something the whole system depended on. He was explicit about what this tendency required as a counterweight. In Democracy in America, he wrote, "If men are to remain civilized or to become so, the art of associating together must grow and improve in the same ratio in which the equality of conditions is increased." Read that again slowly, because it's the hinge of everything. The more equal a society becomes, the more free, the more comfortable, the more able each individual is to handle their own affairs, the more deliberately and actively that society has to practice the art of associating. Not because people are bad, because freedom, over time, makes association feel unnecessary. And when association atrophies, self-governance atrophies with it. The Puritans understood this. That's why the township wasn't optional. That's why Winthrop framed the covenant as a weight. They knew that the system they were building required maintenance. Active, regular, inconvenient maintenance, or it would decay. Not because of enemies, because of gravity. Now, here's where the data becomes important. Because this isn't interpretation, it's measurement. In 2000, the Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam published a book called Bowling Alone. He had spent years tracking the collapse of associational life in America. Civic clubs, PTAs, union membership, church attendance, even bowling leagues. And what he found was a pattern that started in the 1960s and accelerated through the end of the century. Americans were withdrawing. Not dramatically, not all at once, just step by step. Disengaging from the organizations that had historically been the infrastructure of self-governance. The title came from a specific data point. Bowling participation was actually rising, but bowling leagues were collapsing. People were bowling alone. They were still doing the activity. They had stopped doing it together. Putnam called what was being lost social capital, the accumulated trust, reciprocity, and shared knowledge that communities build up over time through regular association. And his argument was Tocquevillian at its core. Social capital is the infrastructure of democracy. When it erodes, democracy becomes a set of procedures without a practice underneath. The religious data tells the same story from a different angle. Pew Research Center data from 2022 shows that the share of Americans who identify as Christian has fallen from roughly 90% in 1972 to 63% today. That's a significant shift, but the more revealing number is the attendance figure. Weekly church attendance among self-identified Christians has fallen below 20% in multiple surveys. People still call themselves Christian. They've stopped going. And in 2021, Gallup confirmed something that had never happened before in their polling history. For the first time, fewer than half of Americans, 47%, reported belonging to a church, synagogue, or mosque. In 1999, that number was 70%. 22 percentage points in 22 years. Not taken. Relinquished. Now, let's name the explanation you've probably been carrying. The culture changed. Forces that were hostile to traditional religion, to civic conservatism, to the values the Puritans embedded in the American founding. Those forces moved strategically over decades through the institutions, the schools, the media, the courts. And what you're seeing in those numbers is the result. The erosion was done to you. That story is not without evidence. It would be dishonest to pretend the institutions didn't change, or that those changes were neutral. They weren't. But here's what that story can't explain. It can't explain why the most dramatic collapse in associational and religious life happened not in communities under direct ideological pressure, but in the comfortable middle, in suburbs, in stable neighborhoods, in families with means and time, and no obvious external force telling them to stop going. It can't explain why the Federal Register, the official record of federal regulations, ran approximately 10,000 pages a year in 1950 and routinely exceeds 80,000 pages today. Nobody passed a single law expanding the administrative state to that scale. It expanded to fill a vacuum. When citizens stopped governing themselves locally, stopped attending the township meeting, stopped running the school board, stopped doing the ordinary maintenance of self-governance, the space doesn't stay empty. It gets filled. That's not a theory. That's a documented institutional pattern. But this still doesn't explain who the real agent of erosion is. We'll get there. Because the answer is going to require dismantling something you may have assumed was solid. Before we get there, there's something I want to mention. There's a workbook in the description called Soft Despotism, a field guide to recognizing it in your life. It's 30 pages, 10 categories: healthcare, education, religion, finance, family, speech, with a self-assessment for each one. Because what this video can do is name the mechanism. What the workbook does is help you locate where, specifically, in your actual life it's operating. The link is in the description. Here is what Tocqueville actually saw. He saw that the great threat to democratic self-governance was not the tyrant who storms the Capitol. It was something far more ordinary. He described a power, and this is close to his actual language, that covers the surface of society with a network of small, complicated rules. A power that doesn't break anyone's will. It softens it. It doesn't forbid. It discourages. It doesn't destroy. It prevents. It doesn't rule. It guides. He called this soft despotism, and he said it would arise not from malice, but from the democratic tendency to outsource, to hand decisions, gradually and without drama, to whatever authority seemed most competent and least inconvenient. But here is the part that changes the frame entirely. The administrative expansion, the growth of the regulatory state, the slow centralization of decisions that previous generations made locally is not the cause of civic retreat. It is its consequence. Tocqueville was precise about this. When citizens stop associating, they stop governing themselves. When they stop governing themselves, they need to be governed by something. The township meeting that nobody attends doesn't stay empty. It gets replaced by a regulatory agency that makes the same decisions in Washington without asking, not through conquest, through vacancy. The bureaucracy didn't defeat the township. The township stopped meeting and the bureaucracy moved in. Now ask yourself the harder question. Not who changed the culture, but when did the comfortable, church-going, flag-flying, tradition-valuing American, the one watching this video, when did that person stop doing the maintenance? Not because anyone forced them to stop, because life got busy, because Sunday mornings filled up with other things, because the school board meeting was at 7:30 on a Tuesday and there was nothing particularly wrong at the school right now, because the civic organization felt optional, because the congregation started to feel like a social obligation rather than a governing body of mutual accountability. The Puritans, remember, didn't treat the covenant as optional. They treated it as a weight, a responsibility that the whole structure depended on. They knew, Winthrop said it plainly, that if they dealt falsely with the covenant, if they let it become ceremony rather than practice, the city upon a hill would become a warning rather than a light. That's not an accusation, it's a mechanism. The same mechanism Tocqueville mapped in 1835, watching it run in real time in the New England townships that were already, even then, a little less rigorous than they had been. The force eroding what the Puritans built was never only external. It was the perfectly ordinary tendency of free people in comfortable circumstances to treat non-negotiable things as optional. One small decision at a time, over many decades, without ever making a dramatic choice to abandon anything. That's the mechanism. Quiet, incremental, dressed as convenience. So here is the question you leave with. Not a call to arms, not a program, just a question. What is one habit, one specific habit of civic or religious participation that you have let become optional that the Puritans would have considered load-bearing? Not the grand gesture, not running for Senate, the small thing, the meeting you could attend, the congregation you could actually participate in, not just attend, the conversation with your grandchildren about what your values are rooted in and why. Not as nostalgia, but as transmission. Something you do regularly because the alternative is vacancy. Tocqueville didn't write as a pessimist. He wrote as a diagnostician who believed the disease was treatable, but only if the patient understood the actual mechanism. The treatment for soft despotism is not outrage. It is association. It is practice. It is showing up to the small things that feel optional, specifically because they feel optional. Because that feeling of optionality is exactly what democratic comfort produces, and exactly what the Puritans refused to accept. They signed the Mayflower Compact in a harbor in November, before they had any idea whether they would survive the winter. They didn't sign it because it was convenient. They signed it because they understood in their bones that what they were building would only stand if they built it on purpose, together, every day. 190 years ago, a Frenchman visited what they built and tried to explain it to the rest of the world. He said it was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. He also said it was fragile, that it required the one thing democratic comfort makes hardest, the daily choice to treat self-governance as a duty rather than an option. A 190-year-old map of the present, the Puritans built something. Whether it stands depends on choices quieter than any election and more consequential than most. The workbook in the description. If you want to take this from a framework to a map of your own life, and if there was a specific moment when you first felt the maintenance slipping, when you first sensed that something important was going unattended, I'd like to know what it was.